Hi, and welcome to another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm Bridget Burns, Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, Doug and I team up to have a conversation with a sitting college president, chancellor, or leader in the field because we want to give you some sense of inspiration and hope and optimism for the week ahead by elevating the kinds of leaders that we think that we should be learning from. So today is definitely no exception from that.
Yeah, we're joined today by Michele Siqueiros, who is president of the Campaign for College Opportunity. And that's a nonprofit based in California that does advocacy and research focused on ensuring that more students can go to college and succeed through them. And obviously, as Bridget said, a lot of times we have institutional leaders on this, but it's important sometimes that we talk to people from around the sort of higher ed ecosystem, people who come at the enterprise from different angles. And Michele, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Well, we're so excited to be able to elevate not just you as a leader, but also for folks to learn a bit more about the work that you do, because it is Californians are very fortunate to have the campaign in their state and your work. And so I'm hoping that we might start off there with, for those who live in a state that doesn't have something like this, can you give a sense of what you do so that they can understand why this might be valuable, especially as they think about interacting with policymakers and higher education?
Yeah, well, our founders believed, and our mission continues to be, that there needs to be an independent alliance of unlikely allies, civil rights leaders, business leaders, community folks that care about higher education, especially concerned about access for, higher ed for low income, underrepresented students, as well as completion. So that has really been the purpose and mission, is to be an independent voice that centers students in all aspects, and that really pushes to ensure that more California students can go to college, and that once they get there, they actually graduate.
There obviously are a lot of actors, again, sort of around the higher ed ecosystem. Some of them are legal, some of them are consumer protection, et cetera. But in terms of sort of who represents students, we want to be clear. It's not that we necessarily think that institutions don't represent students, but they have a lot of different interests. And so I'm curious, just as you think about an organization like yours, obviously believes that higher education is important, but it also believes sort of that it needs to be sometimes pressured and held accountable to ensure that it's pursuing the putting students, at least mostly, if not heavily, at the center.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, Doug, about my own experience. When I went to college, I was the first in my family. I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm the daughter of immigrants. I was a low-income kid. And when I graduated, I was the first in my family to graduate from college. And I used to think that I was lucky. And I share this story a lot because, of course, I wasn't just lucky. I certainly worked hard and got good grades, but I had incredible counselors and teachers who believed in me. I had UCLA students who went to my high school and helped me fill out college applications. I had financial aid that allowed me to go to college and be able to be that first-gen student. So it wasn't luck. It was people, right? It was financial aid. It was affirmative action. Back then, I went to graduate school on an affirmative action full ride fellowship. And so it was a mix of, what institutions were doing and the policies that were in place. And so I just firmly believe that the policies that we support, the way we set up student services, that's what helps make college a reality for those of us who aren't born into wealth and privilege.
I'm curious about, I want to get more into you as a leader, but I also feel like, given that you have led the campaign since 2014, or it was 2012, I'm sure, like, oh my God.
2008, but I've been with the campaign since its founding in 2004, so it's been a little bit.
So since 2008, you've been leading this organization, and I'm just wondering, we're always looking for a little bit of hope. And while there are plenty of things that are not going right now, I'm wondering if there is some context that as you look at your work, that you are optimistic, that you see progress that makes you feel like this is actually moving in the right direction. When you're looking for that kind of evidence, what do you focus on within your work?
You know, I always really grapple and like hold on to the incredible innovation and resourcefulness that we see in higher ed. I mean, I think the pandemic has been really difficult for every one of us, and especially those who have lost loved ones and who have become ill because of COVID. But what you've seen in higher education and across, leadership is a real flexibility and removal of hurdles and things that do give me hope about what we can do, right? How responsive higher ed was to be able to pivot so quickly and go online, to be able to identify that broadband access was a problem and figure out how to solve that, to get, laptops and equipment out to students who didn't have those resources. I think a real realization in higher ed, right, about how the system, again, could be much more student-centered and focused on providing that a real opportunity, a full and inclusive opportunity to students. That gives me a lot of hope. And I know that as we hopefully, get to the end of this pandemic, that some of those innovations will stay in place. The other thing that gives me a lot of hope, Bridget, is the reality that the conversation has turned in our state, and I think across the nation, from just access to higher education to real thoughtfulness about what does real access mean, right? Ensuring that we're providing for the full cost of affordability in higher ed, figuring out how to support students to succeed, addressing racial inequality, which persists in higher education, and making sure what is it that we're doing differently to serve students better and to close intentionally, to work towards closing the gaps that persist for Black and Latinx students, especially in our state, where Latinx students are the largest ethnic group. The future of our state will depend on whether or not we serve Latinx students well.
How much ground, or what do you think has happened to that population's interaction with higher education during this period? We've obviously seen, meaningful evidence of sort of increased dislocation, more dislocation for those groups than for others. And in some ways, my sense is that we had seen some pretty good progress in the couple of years leading up to the pandemic. Again, probably not sufficient in a lot of people's eyes, but movement in the right direction and in that direction. And I guess I've certainly had some worries that has been blunted, if not sort of set back. And I'm just curious kind of how it looks from where you sit. And do you think it's, what is your thinking about sort of the either permanence or how long of a tail that's likely to have?
I think how long a tail that's likely to have and how devastating the impact is in terms of reversing all of the gains that underrepresented students have made is going to depend on whether our state leaders and campus leaders are even more aggressive and intentional about serving students better. Because, Doug, we see it at every level. The number of Latinx students in LAUSD, for example, which serves the greatest number of Latino students, in terms of the numbers that have taken the A through G courses, which in our state are required for college admission, there's been a decline, a huge decline, not insignificant, decline in graduation rates, decline in college going rates. Nationally, we know that Black and Latinx males in particular have declined their enrollment in community colleges. And it's devastating. I hear from campus leaders that they're down 20 to 30%. We know that they serve the most vulnerable students. So is that a lost generation? Or do our leaders and our policymakers make the kinds of investments and intentional outreach and engagement to bring folks back? It's devastating. I think that is absolutely what worries me the most, and certainly keeps me up at night in terms of what are we going to do about this work. And I think there are leaders that are demonstrating that certainly we shouldn't be paralyzed by that reality, but we do have to be intentional about what's going to happen. What are we going to do? How are we going to step up and lead in this time?
So I want to focus on that question of what we can do and what you're hopeful about, but based on what you're proudest of. I think that you've accomplished a great deal in your time at the campaign. And I also, you and I were part of a task force with the governor's office. And my observation is that you've done a lot and that your organization has done a lot. And I'm just curious about when you're reflecting back and you're trying to think about what, if you had to pick like one win that you're proudest of, what is it that you would draw upon?
You're making it so hard. One win. Since you're making me pick, I'm going to say the elimination of placement into remedial courses at community colleges. I continue to believe that that is the single biggest civil rights issue, not just because I believe it, but because the data demonstrates that it's true. The number of Latinx and Black students overplaced in remedial courses where they are not supported to actually succeed and go into college level courses really was an atrocity. One of my good friends likes to say that remedial courses are where college dreams go to die. And she's absolutely right. So I've been incredibly proud in the last few years to see that single policy change across the California community college system has given incredible access to students, and that access to Black and Latinx students in particular, where they not only are enrolling in college level courses, they're passing those courses and they're moving forward to complete a degree or a certificate and to transfer. And there's still a lot of work to be done there, but that makes me so proud. Every time I see the numbers, I remember like the numbers, as somebody often says, right? The numbers are students, they're people, they're real lives that are being impacted. And that makes me incredibly proud. And it wasn't, I think it makes me proud too, because although we've done incredible work on transfer and financial aid, this issue is not like the sexy issue in policymaking, right? And yet it's so important.
How, maybe shifting to a little bit more to sort of you as a leader also, how do you, but maybe blending it, how do you bring the personal experience that you talked about at the beginning that clearly motivates you, and how do you bring that to your work? How purposefully and how sort of transparently do you bring that to your work sort of day in, day out? I think that may be something that different kinds of leaders wrestle with a little bit, is sort of how much, because how do you infuse it in your work without sort of making it potentially too personal in ways that, I don't know. I'm just curious how you think about that.
I think, Doug, it is who I am. And I'm so proud of where I've gotten, not because, and especially not because I wouldn't have gotten here by myself. It is not like any kind of like perceived sense that, it's my talent. The reality is that I think of my peers, those that I feel were left behind, that didn't have the chance to go to college, who were in many cases, I thought, smarter than me, more talented, definitely had the capacity. So I think it is very personal. It comes from a very, philosophically, a belief that I think is based in reality, that every person has the capacity to succeed. What every person doesn't have is the opportunity to do that. So it's infused in everything I do because it's been my experience. And, I think Justice Sotomayor wrote about this in her memoir, where she talks about, being motivated by that guilt. And I think a lot of us who are the first are motivated by a sense of guilt. But then also, talking to students, we get to work with community college and Cal State and UC students all the time, and just hearing their own experiences, that grounds me, because my experience is a little bit old now, right? And so it's certainly not the current experience for every student, but I feel like I definitely come to it from a very I can relate place, and that's incredibly motivating.
Old is all relative, I just have to say.
Agreed.
So I'm curious about, given that you do really you're somewhat exhibit A of the students that we want to serve, and you have that expertise, and you also have the image of the folks that you would want to serve in your mind. I'm curious about what has been, given your background, what is the most surprising thing about your career and how you ended up?
The most surprising thing about my career, Bridget, I used to think that I had to do it alone, that I had to know everything, that I had to be very knowledgeable before I got into particular spaces and rooms. So I think the most surprising thing is realizing as a leader that I think one of the most important leadership traits is to stay inquisitive and to understand that you don't know everything, and to be open to learning constantly from others. I think I became a much better leader when I realized, and part of this was becoming a mom and recognizing that I didn't have the bandwidth to do everything professionally. I couldn't lead an organization by myself. Being able to bring other incredible talent around me and supporting that talent and allowing that talent to lead. So if I'm a good leader, it's because I've had Jesse Ryan and Audrey Dow at my side for quite some time. And together we've been, I think, a formidable force. And that's been, I think, the biggest lesson.
I want to push on that just a little bit further, because I've been thinking a lot about the role of humility and even sort of vulnerability in this moment. And I think I see more of it from people generally, but including from leaders. And I'm curious whether that's what you talked about, sort of edges up to that. But I'm curious if you feel like you have become more willing to show vulnerability. And I guess, given what we've all been through collectively, I'm just curious whether you think that's something that, if you've embraced that more, do you think it's something that we'll hold on to going forward?
Absolutely. And I will say, Doug, that was incredibly difficult for me. I think as a woman and as a woman of color, to be vulnerable, to show that you don't know something in an environment that isn't often welcoming, isn't something that, made me feel very comfortable at all. I know one of the things that you were thinking of asking me is one of the most challenging things in leadership that I've experienced. And one of those was just surviving the recession in 2009, 10, 11. I was leading an organization that essentially had to shrink almost 40%. And that meant I had to lay off several staff. And in thinking about how to do that in the most humane way, and thinking about how do I ensure that this organization survives, because the work that we do is important, it definitely, I had to lay off people I cared about. And anyone who's ever had to do that knows that that's the worst part of the job. And so that probably was one of the first moments where I said, I just have to be really honest. I have to show the finances, show what it is that I'm doing, do it with as much humanity and grace as possible. And I think one of the things I'm really proud of is folks that I've had to lay off during that time, I'm still in touch with. I still have a relationship with. And even when I've had staff that, it doesn't, as any organization, you're going to have staff that don't work out. I think I feel proud that we treat everybody with the respect and humanity that they deserve. I think obviously all our institutions need to do that too, right? To the best of their abilities.
That's great. Yeah, I think that is always consistently the thing we hear is the hardest, is the really difficult decision around letting people go. So, but I'm curious about if you received any good advice from anyone to help you with that process. But beyond that, more broadly, I'm just interested in what advice someone else has given you in your career that you have consistently drawn upon that has helped you the most.
You know, I have been incredibly fortunate to have had good leaders teach me how to lead, and to have incredible board members that have supported my leadership in this role. You know, beginning with our founders, David Wolf and Steve Weiner and Bill Hauk, all three of them who've since left us, but who I think of all the time. You know, they taught me that it's hard to do hard things. And I think about their advice all of the time, because they also taught me that it's only worth doing if it's hard and difficult. I think it could be very easy in this space and in leadership to just focus on being loved or liked or supported. And the reality is that, you know, when you're pushing significant change, sometimes even your friends aren't supportive. And I think that's hard always. I'm not going to, pretend it isn't. Because when we think we're doing something that's really good for students and right for students, we imagine everybody should be supportive of this. But obviously we live in a diverse space and people have diverse interests and diverse opinions. So I think what I always draw on in those difficult moments is that they really have supported me to be strong and to have committed focus on doing what's right. And I appreciate that I get to lead an organization where I don't feel my values, our values are ever compromised.
In terms of what sort of spinning that, sort of turning it out around a little bit, you must get approached all the time by people asking you for advice, given that you were a first, as you were describing before. What tends to be the advice that you give aspiring leaders of organizations like yours, or the people you run into within higher education who want to sort of envision themselves as potentially leading institutions, particularly maybe about sort of being a first, but I don't know if that's what tends to dominate. But what's the advice that you tend to give others?
I would say there's two things I always think about when I'm talking to new leaders, and one is that they have to, I recommend just get comfortable with not knowing everything. I think it's unreasonable to expect that you're going to know everything, that you're going to know everything right away. And again, most of the leaders I'm talking to are people of color, where, the kinds of experiences and challenges we face as leaders are different. And so showing vulnerability or lack of information in certain cases is, we tend to over prepare. And so I just remind them, it's okay not to know everything, because you're going to walk into a room, and this is what I discovered early on. I was often the youngest, sometimes the only woman, definitely the only Latina. That continues to be the case in many, many rooms. And I realized that the folks sitting around the table don't know everything either. And so I think there's a moment where you're like, oh, I do know things that other people don't know. And there's other things that they don't, realize, and that they do have to offer. And so I think that's one. And number two is build a good team of talent around you that you can trust, that has your back, that is incredibly competent, that you can nurture. I think that this idea that one leader, leads by him or herself is just outdated and unrealistic. Right? If we lead and we're successful at leading, we have a whole team of people helping us get there and do the things that we do. So I think those are the two things I always share with folks.
Well, I think that is the perfect way for us to end today in terms of some inspiring perspective for the week ahead. We're already getting some comments. Oh, Joni Finney, love her. Positive kudos from afar. So I'm just so delighted by the work that you've done, and it's been an honor to be able to partner with you in various initiatives. So, but for folks at home, this is a chance for you to see what your leadership advice and perspective, and also to think about what value it might bring to have something like the campaign in your state. So that being said, folks at home, we hope this has been giving you some optimism, some perspective, and some hope for the week ahead. We know that we're all rounding the bases when it comes to the end of the year. You might see Doug and I again. You might not. We might just call it. We might wrap and come back in the new year. So, but we hope this has served you and been able to give you that optimistic perspective that we're always aspiring for. So, Michele, thank you so much. Doug, as always, excellent co-hosting.
Hope everybody has a great holiday season if we don't see you.
Yep. Happy holidays.
Bye.